trauma, and ultimately kind of reappropriating resurrection mythologies as a possibility for myself and for other queer survivors. And I am an artist and activist and occasionally an educator and fashion designer. And my work consistently confronts personal and national legacies of violence. Prior to this series, I was mostly involved in racial justice movements and for 4 years co-founded and directed Confront White Womanhood, which was anti-racism for white women. And I'm particularly committed at this point in my work to exploring the intersections of trauma and white supremacy culture and how we engage in deeper emotionally centered conversations and healing, particularly holding space for the ways in which we are both victims and perpetrators of violence. And yeah, this is a personally important conversation since it is part of my experience, and going through that experience and then also making this work and showing this work, I felt like there was not a lot of information, resources, or conversations happening around me, and it was a very isolating experience. So I hope that we can kind of offer a little bit of space for that so folks can feel a little less alone, and maybe have a few more resources on how to support others in our community with these experiences. Yeah, so with that, I'm going to introduce our panelists and read their bios. I always over-prepare, so I have a million questions, which we probably not get to. But I'm going to start right next to me is Erica Gold-Bustos. She, her, Ella, and she is a biracial, indigenous, Latinx, white, Jewish, queer community organizer with expertise in the domestic violence, intimate partner violence, and sexual assault survivorship field. She's been on the steering committee for both March to End Rape Culture and Take Back the Night Philly since 2017, 2018. Worked with Me Too on their 5th anniversary of the hashtag, and often acts as a victim advocate and educator while working towards liberation in all intersecting oppressions and working at a local climate justice organization. And next to Erica is Robin Gao, He is a disabled trans poet and witch from rural Pennsylvania. He is the author of several poetry collections, an essay collection, and middle grade and YA novels. It works at Bradbury Sullivan LGBT Community Center as the director of the Education Institute. As an autistic person, Robin feels passionate about celebrating neurodivergent folks in the queer community. Gao has presented nationally on supporting LGBTQ+ survivors of domestic and intimate partner violence, and he is a survivor himself. And again, we have Rain Black. He is an autistic sex worker, watercolor artist, and forager who earned Fayer's bachelor's degree in biology, public health, and art from Cedar Crest College. He holds a Master of Public Health degree in epidemiology from the University of South Florida. In Fayer's spare time, Faye teaches about native plants, forest conservation, and foraging on social media and in person. He is a survivor of 2 instances of domestic violence and talks with groups as an educator and as a means to connect with and support other survivors. Thank you guys for being here. So my first is just for everybody to share, like, you can again. You can speak to your specific backgrounds and experiences with domestic violence and intimate partner violence, specifically within the queer community. So who wants to go first?
Go first. So my experience is when I was 17, I was married to a much older man. I grew up in rural Mississippi, so that was like more common there. So basically I was 15 when I met this person, and then my parents married me off to him. And then I was in that for 5 years, got out and immediately got gotten by another person, unfortunately, and that was a trans man. And I was with him for 10 years and only recently got out of that experience. Both of those relationships were very different, but they held very like similar characteristics, I guess you could say. And I think those experiences are interesting to compare, as well as just like how I personally dealt with them. With the first one, I didn't really talk a lot at all. And the second one was not the case, and I had a much better sort of experience getting out of it, because I was speaking more about it. And yeah, so that's most of my experience is like having with it.
I can go back. Yeah. I have had like several experiences around like dating violence and relationship violence, but the one that's specific to the queer community happened during my master's of fine arts program in creative writing with someone who was also trans. I think that we connected very quickly on that. I lived with her throughout my program. And I think from the beginning, it was something that was abusive, and I think I don't remember a time where I like wasn't afraid of her. But we shared everything. So like every class, my program was very small. We had a cohort of about 8 people. So we shared every class and we worked in the same office. Like we were very, very intertwined, and most of our cohort in my MFA was also queer. And I think that it really being able to leave that, I mean, only essentially because of the pandemic, which, you know, it's a terrible thing, so I'm not like arguing anything, but the pandemic happened, like we all lost our jobs and kind of like scattered out of New York City. And that was really the only reason that I got out of it, because if not, I think I would have like really continued with that cycle a lot more. And I do find myself like still inclined to cycles of abuse sometimes, but that was like the only reason I felt like that, or I really got that interrupted. And then my other experiences are just as somebody who's been like an advocate for folks who are experiencing domestic violence situations. I worked at an organization that supports victims and survivors called Turning Point of Lehigh Valley, and there I tried to revamp our programs to be more inclusive to queer survivors, and it was incredibly difficult. I don't know how much I succeeded, but I think that like that experience working in that sphere has also like really informed how I've understood my own experiences and you know, like a lack of support that I felt.
Yeah, so I am a survivor of DV, IPV, and SA. And that's how that informs my work, but I'm also a queer person who, in my advocacy and specifically in my work in survivorship, have worked within, therefore, like my own community, so within the queer community, and especially queer communities of color, Black, Indigenous, those people of color to specify. So yeah.
Awesome, thank you guys for the feedback. Yeah, so I wanted to like just kind of start with barriers for queer survivors, and there's often a myth that this is not something that queer people experience. There's the idea that queer community and queer relationships are somehow better and more devoid of violence than heterosexual communities. And just kind of putting it out there to anyone who wants to speak on it, like, why do you think that is? Like, how does that hurt us? And what might we do to counter that? Yeah.
I think part of it came out of self-protection. I think outside communities, the dominant, the powerful, already have a narrative of queer people as predatory, as groomers, as violent, as the big bad. And I think, like any marginalized community within DV, IVP, SA, there is like an element of protection there, of wanting, it's like a single shooter narrative of like white people, and it's like don't have to worry about that being indicative of like an entire community, and marginalized people do. And so I do think part of the narrative is to protect it, I think, and then that plays into the larger idea of like this being a very sort of like private thing to go to. Like people tend to just, as it is, like keep it within literally the home. And so then when you also want to protect yourself from outside harmful narratives of homophobia and transphobia, And then along with, especially if you were Black, Indigenous, otherwise the racism that then also goes along with that. I think that's definitely part of it. Yeah, for sure.
That's a super powerful point, like there's like who has the right to have privacy. The way that myth can double down on that.
But I think that knowledge also like impacted like the way I thought about my partner who was abusing me, because like I think that I made more excuses for her than I did past partners, because I like in those other relationships I was in like a relationship that like looked straight passing. I've always identified as bi, but at the time I had presented more feminine, so like it looked like a straight relationship when I was like much younger. And you know, dating like a cisgender man, like I didn't have the same kinds of like fears of like, or like kind of like empathy towards that experience. And I actually think that it sometimes fed into the experience with the other trans person being like worse, because like even when she was doing something that was like blatantly violent or blatantly like scary, I would be like, well, I know that this comes from, or like I would rationalize it like this comes from trauma, which like even if it did, like you know, I have trauma, but I don't abuse people. So I think though that like the other side of it then being like I put that as like I don't want people to think terribly of my partner or like something bad to happen to her. So yeah.
Yeah, that's protection.
I would also sort of like to bring up. Sorry. Okay, wow. The idea of statistics on this stuff too, right? Like when people look up facts on things, who reports, and then how those reports get reported. And then also like, even if you do report, do you feel safe at identifying as queer trans? Like all those play into the statistics of things. So if you're theoretically going to research the stats on like TV, IPV, in the queer community, that also is skewed because of oppression, quite frankly.
Yeah, definitely, like besides like a person, like how they would interact with it, so like a cop or something, but even like do their forms collect that information? It's like if you don't collect information, you can't then quantify it, so it's like we're guessing. I think too, like I experienced that as well, like intellectualizing what was occurring to me, and being like, well, this person has trauma and like we can try to work through this, but it's like at a certain point, like people can behave a certain way, and if they're not doing anything about it, then that's a choice, you know. And it's like maybe they can't, but like at some point there has to be like accountability and whatnot. But I found myself like making a lot of excuses and wanting to protect that other person from like the police or something, because it's like, well, I'm in danger, and I don't like to involve police on a good day, you know. But you know, it's like, am I going to die in this situation? But like, what if they attacked him, you know? And it's like it's hard because you're doing like these mental gymnastics in your head for that other person who is harming you, but I think it comes out of like kindness or like caring for your community. And I think that that's a different element that doesn't really like factor in like a cis head, like even like if it's just like a passing sort of relationship like that, like if it appears like it's cis head. Because even in my first relationship, which was more like heterosexual looking, that person would like be homophobic to me and transphobic to me, even though they were in a relationship with me. So it's like there's different dynamics with it. And I think in the more overtly queer relationship, that person kind of like doubled down on the toxic masculinity and like went all in, and didn't really accept me as myself. So I'm somewhere in the trans mask realm of things. It's complicated because I present very feminine also. But misogyny can like factor into that stuff, and it's like how they see you, and then who you like based on that.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the identity abuse piece, because I think that is also something really unique to queer and trans folk, like whoever they're partnered with, is that oftentimes our identities can be a targeted form of violence. And yeah, I just also want to echo that, like, that the experience of being really protective of our community absolutely played a role in like being able to see the abuse that was happening, being able to speak on it. Like, I wanted to protect my partner at all costs, and then ultimately that cost was me. And you know, that's how do we get to the point where like we can protect ourselves without putting our community members in further danger. So I'll get into more of those questions later on, but I just wanted to say that. And just sort of in this like access to resources of like how do we navigate that sphere. A lot of the DV resources are very like heteronormative in their focus. Like some actually have very strict rules around like who can engage with them. There's just like the model of abuse is like male user, female victim, and like that's just like replicated over and over in so many different formats. And given that that's kind of like our understanding of what abuse is, like how does that impact our ability to understand our own experiences and gain access to support and resources around us?
Yeah, and I think a lot about it, like when I was working in this domestic violence program, but we got very trained in that like cycle of abuse. And I remember like saying to the teacher, like, oh, this is about like power dynamics, and power dynamics happen like marginalization, poverty, all sorts of other things that have to do with other than like gender or even gender presentation. Like it's not just like this specific, very specific dynamic. And then being like, oh, well, like, you know, this is the like predominant one, which is not statistically true. But I think it just kind of speaks to like, there's like people don't want to dive into like power dynamics, because I think if you start to engage in it, you also start to realize like the ways abuse is normalized in like a lot of spheres of life, like in workplaces, like in like by our government. Like I think that it's part of the impetus behind it being so closed, the idea of abuse is that like if you open it up, then you're like, wow, like so many things are abusive and coercive. And I think that that narrow definition also like misses queer relationships a lot, because like we might not have the like checkbox things because of also barriers sometimes. Like we might not, I don't know, live together, have children together, or have something like that, but have different kinds of enmeshed relationships that are hard to untangle. Yeah, I hope that like spoke to like what you said, but it like spun off somewhere.
Yeah, that's great.
I have no idea where it came from, but
So, sorry, I was also gonna add to just thinking about, like the barriers to, like just even voicing abuse in intimate partner relationships, for in the queer community, like growing up for myself, but I can only speak personally, there were very few representations even of queer people in like relationships, first of all, right? The representations that I did see in the media were very kind of like stereotypical, mostly, you know, white gay male centered. And so, yeah, growing up in Ohio, because I came out when I was 17, and like, that's all I had, you know, were these kind of, these representations that were very far from the truth, right? And because even like representations of intimate relationships across the board, right, are like, no one teaches us really how to be in a healthy, functioning relationship. And I didn't learn that until I became an adult, like recently, within the last 10 years. So it's, I just wanted to add that too, like, as part of our kind of like, our shared public consciousness, it hasn't really, you know, being in healthy relationships has not really been before in media.
Yeah, along those lines, to answer the question about like, how does the lack of representation in these support systems affect the way we can seek resources and support? I meis it's incredibly intertwined, like, right, if you literally do not have them, as many as cis het people, within a structured setting, that makes you feel isolated, even more so in a category where isolation is the point.
Yeah.
And so you're already coming from a lens of like, I have no way, I have no one. And so if you're like having a moment where you're like, maybe I could leave, and then you look for it and it's not there, that just deepens your understanding of your own isolation or validates the lie that you,
Yeah.
and in some ways not lie, right? Like you are in a community where there aren't other queer folks or other dynamics, and like you literally physically and emotionally are isolated. And to the second part of the question of like, how do we then seek support if they're not in structured systems? I think that's where community support comes in. I know that that's coming up later, to more in depth, so I'll save the like details of it, but that's where my models of like transformative justice come in, community accountability, community support within. And I also, to folks who are physically isolated, it's like the internet can be such a double-edged sword, but with things like this, when you're like physically isolated, it can be such a gift to find spaces of folks in similar position, to seek support from when there aren't models. And I will say, just to plug up in Philadelphia, for folks who are watching or are here who are seeking it, I do believe WAA, Women Against Abuse, is trans encompassing. I believe Women in Transition is trans and queer encompassing. I believe Amazonian and white as well. So just for folks who are looking for that.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that. Yeah, I think that is definitely, the isolation piece is definitely on my list to talk about. And you know, abusive relationships, we always understand them to be deeply isolating, and then there is the compounded experience of like when you spoke on the isolation of like literally not having the resources, and you know, the ways that queer community can then become our family, and to lose that is way more isolating than it is with folks that don't necessarily have that bond with their community, that may still be in touch with their family of origin or things like that. Yeah, sorry, I was trying to think where the question was going with that. Yeah, I mean, I guess just there was just general questions here around like, what does this added isolation mean for us? I mean, I think we'll address that, but like moving into how do we show up for survivors? So like, given the situation where like, okay, maybe you're isolated, and the community resources, the structural resources are not there. We spoke a little bit to online, but like, how do we reach out to community? How do we find those resources in a deeply isolating moment when like, I know for me, when I was separating, like I had to call like 10 different agencies to try and get help before like a friend finally referred me to the Anti-Violence Project, which in New York City is one of the main and only queer specific organizations providing support. But like, what do we do in those moments?
I think as like an individual, first off, I think a very impactful thing that you can do is just believe the person. Like whatever they're presenting to you, believe them, validate them, because often when you are in that experience, you often get gaslit, you know, or just told that your experience isn't real, it's not that bad, it's not happening. And that might be from the abuser, but it could also be from other sources like a job or like your family, you know, because they'll be like, well, on the outside this looks all right, but it's like they don't see what happens behind closed doors, because some abusers operate like that, like they're more like presentable in public, and they kind of hide that part of themselves. So believing people, asking them, and they may not know, but like asking what you can do to help, like what they need in that moment, if that's just like body doubling while they call people, a couch that they can sleep on, like whatever you have available. Offering that freely and with love, because I think that's really like what matters to people, even if it's like a small thing, like a conversation. I think that's very impactful, because maintaining that community is critical. Definitely after, so in my 2 experiences, the first one I had nobody and just kind of like got out by the skin of my teeth, by myself. And the second one I had community, and it was easy, or it's still very difficult. And I tried to like reach out to organizations, both my job and which is an LGBT center, and like other organizations, and they don't really have anything that like fits. But even in like a workplace setting, like if someone comes to you believing them and like trying to meaningfully help them in that situation, because I find that some workplaces handle it like it's two bickering people, and not like an abuse situation, that like someone is actually in danger, and so they don't take it as seriously as they should, and do right by the survivor. Yeah, so those are kind of like my broad suggestion.
I think that goes for like groups of people too, because I think that that's something I've really experienced, like in my like master's program cohort, is like telling people like, I think that this is really bad, and people being like, oh, like that's just like kind of playing it off. I think that people also like don't know how to respond to abuse, especially when you're like telling them. And I think that people in that situation probably said some of the like worst possible things you could say, which was not just like, I believe you, it was like, and the other thing that like played against me in that whole situation is that my partner was incredibly charismatic. People loved her. People like, and they had such a different experience with her, and our communities are always so intertwined and small. I mean, like the queer community is huge, but it's also like, you know someone who knows someone, and you get it's like that, a map in the L word, like, but it really is, it's like, I know somebody knows somebody who always knows someone, and so that also made the like coming out about any kind of abuse with her really difficult, because like everyone likes her, also she knows everyone, and I tend to be a little bit quieter, I'm like a neurodivergent person, and I like did not present myself as like largely in my cohort, and I think that it was difficult, and I think that there are lots of like little politics that go along, especially when we're talking about like abuse in queer communities too, of like people like this person, and so they want to make excuses for them. And I think that that's another thing that people can do, is to, you can recognize someone's humanity, while also like not making those excuses. Like you can say like, yes, this is a person and we are all queer and we like want them to still be a person, but like there's room for that, while also being like, they have to be held accountable in some way.
Right.
Or like, we can't just continue to operate as if nothing's happening, because that's one of the things that I felt like contributed most to like a gaslighting feeling, and things that like I told myself to like stop making a big deal about it, because everything, you would have experienced the thing and then you go back to your life and everything is normal, and that's like very jarring.
Yeah, I think folks spoke a lot about what you do, in individual and on the personal, obviously in terms of advocacy. I think the same tactics that we use to move the dial, and things like government, are the same things that we use for organizations, to do more organizing around the orgs that already do DV, say IPV, and push for there to be resources for folks who are queer and trans as well, and like experts in those fields. But sometimes they offer it, but there's no one there that's like actually an expert in the field, which, you know, therapy and whatnot is only as good as the therapist in many ways. So folks don't have an understanding of how that works. Definitely a thing, and then, yeah, and self-advocate for it. Not just being receptive yourself, but also advocating for folks who have tried to come forward and are receiving that support. And even if they are, just to make sure that you also advocating for them as well. Because it really is such like there's always going to be people who don't believe you. It's again less likely if someone is like outwardly violent, because they're like, oh yeah, yes, of course I believe you, because they're violent to everyone. But I think the most common really is the person with clout, the person with charisma, the person with talent. I think is a big thing, especially since we're in the art space, trying like that's true. And depending on the other dynamics that you have, they will like literally prey upon that popularity, and that we're knowing that they can sometimes make you into the abuser. Like you're not just crazy and jail, but like you're coming to them, like you're giving like whatever. And nowadays, obviously, therapy rooms are now like you know, and certainly the queer community is very familiar. So it's like a straight men are doing it, absolutely, it's affecting the queer community as well. And so I think, yeah, making sure that you are, yeah, you're not mistaking holding humanity, like you said, for accountability. It's like a very specific thing. It's like you've been like, yeah, like I believe you, but then you're still hanging out with this person, but you're not, is like no one's saying to isolate them. But if you're not holding them accountable, then you're just enabling behavior. Even if you say I believe you, if there's no sort of social consequence or healing from the abuser themselves, and you're just enacting harm or enabling harm again. So there's nothing stopping them from repeating patterns, and especially if it comes from their own trauma, that's not stopping.
Yeah, I mean, it's all really poignant. I mean, I just keep thinking about that, like, really the ways in which not being believed and having things be normalized kind of compounds that like distorted sense of reality and like unable to kind of grip onto things. And it always sounds so simplistic, but yeah, believe people when they say their experience. And I'm like thinking back to what Robin you said earlier, it's just like also when you like unpack the assumption that they're the heteronormative assumption that like abuser is male and victim is, you know, like there's so much around power that like we keep talking about, and like undoing that really forces us to look at power dynamics in a really intimate way, from like neurodivergency to race to like, you know, who has the most charm in a community or social clout and all of those things. And those are much bigger things to untangle than simply like putting people into little boxes and like addressing it in that way. And holding that complexity is not easy, but really what leads to true like safety and healing, I think. So Erica, you've mentioned a little bit about transformative, and I'm hoping that maybe you can just tell everybody what is transformative justice, how does that work, what do mediations look like, whatever you want to share around.
Yeah, so transformative justice is a political framework around abuse, harm, violence, that sort of seeks to circumvent the carceral system that we were in and address the systemic reasons along with the personal, and seeks to find healing for everyone, and not just a pathway for the victim to feel safe, but also in a way to stop that cycle from the abuser themselves by addressing those things and by holding their own experiences with those systems in it, And by understanding that carceral systems, be it in the literal carceral system of like prison and police, and then also in the interpersonal carceral systems of just like isolation. How those instead of stopping cycles tend to just make sure that they're ensured and replicated. And when you focus on healing, still with the survivor centered, I always like to say that because some people mistake it as like now we're like focusing on only the abuser, and then the victim can sometimes get lost in it. But by holding everyone, that's where like true healing and safety can come from. Especially because when we rely on things like isolation, whatever, like cool, they just move and hurt someone else, or you know, no one's actually keeping an eye on them, so just going to a different space, even in the same city. So it's statistically a little bit more effective at curbing those, and then it also keeps folks out of a carceral system that we know just replicates harm. And also especially when we look at the ways that those only affect really those who are already marginalized by those systems, and those who have the most power usually aren't affected by it at all anywhere. So it also seeks to like corrupt that imbalance as well. Mediations are a part of that. I always like to, you know, give a caveat that mediation can only happen, and it can only happen if both parties are willing to do it, right? Like you can't make someone be accountable, you can't make someone show up to mediation willing to do so, and there are sort of different pathways after. But if folks are genuinely open to that, then really you meet with the survivor first and foremost, see what their sort of goals, asks, wishes for safety and healing come from, and then either meet with, usually typically meet with either separately first, and then if they feel safe enough, sometimes together. But oftentimes it's still like a separate path, but basically you go to the person who has done harm, because it doesn't necessarily have to be me specifically, but it has done harm, with the asks and requests of the person harm, and then they agree to do those things, ideally, and then not you sort of like work with them until you can get them to that place. And typically a personal network of theirs also is like working in tandem to hold them accountable, to make sure that they adhere to those needs.
So there's sort of like social pressure and support for the person who's done the harm.
Yeah,
to stay accountable.
yeah. Support for the person who has done harm is sort of into it. Because left to their own, people can say anything, but sort of left to their own devices, it doesn't necessarily mean they're even with the best intentions, right? Like if you're, especially so many of these things are not innate, but they have become embedded in your behavior. And so especially if you have like outside folks that are like looking to kind of hold you accountable and be like, then that is easier for you as well as the person who has harmed. Yeah.
What are some of the biggest challenges in those kinds of interventions?
I mean, it's really just like how, again, this process are only as successful in the way that it exists now, in so much as other people want to engage in them, because transformative justice is not the general model, and so there is no like formal way to make sure that happens, and so and then that also extends to like how big the network and community is that will hold them accountable, right? Because if it's only a few people that like care, then that's not, you know, nearly as effective as if like the whole community is like, we're interested in this framework, and like, and sometimes that means like removal from specific spaces. It doesn't mean you as an individual are isolated from care and support. But it does sometimes mean that like you are not allowed in certain spaces, and so like. With that same agreement, like if people are allowing them in there, or like, not agreeing to like adhere to like demands of those, I should say demands, the needs of the survivor to feel safe. It's like, again, can only be as effective as the willing participants in it. And then with the carceral system and violence out like around us and all recurring trauma around us, that's also a barrier, because a huge part of transport justice is healing itself. And so if you're constantly being re-traumatized as a partner and as a survivor, that's also a blockade to the process working the way that it needs to.
Yeah, I feel like a big shift around moving towards transformative justice stuff, or this process in general, is moving away from our instinct to want to have like a quick fix. Like that is what the carceral system keeps feeding on, is our desire to just like have a quick fix, have it done with, push it aside. But like these processes really take deep involvement from our communities, and like it is their communities that like can really affect our wellness and our ability to move through these moments, like whether or not they show up, whether or not they believe us, whether or not they like hold space for accountability and support in that. And it's so easy. The easy solution is to call the cops, to do a sort of like either straight up separate yourself, isolate, leave the community, or go to a carceral system. And I think as queer folks, like we are more targeted, usually on DV calls. I should throw these random things out. DV calls most of the time, like both people will wind up being arrested. Like there's not like, so then you're re-traumatizing yourself through that process. There are so many ways in which when we engage with a carceral system, it's just going to continue to harm our community, and then like damage the love and support that we want to nurture within our community. But the honest truth is that the alternate is messy and takes a lot of time and investment. And yeah, it requires a lot of willingness from those around us.
Yeah, you can take, truly engaging in conflict mediation for things like violence and abuse can take years. And that's deeply hard. Especially even if you're just like in a smaller group and you're like, well, I just want them to be good. And again, I want to be cool and like, that's not how it works. And I think also sometimes people put resolutions on transformative justice that don't exist. Like just because it's transformative justice doesn't mean that like these two people are gonna be like hanging out again. Like, there are certain things that like where you're safety mean that like you just aren't in these spaces anymore. You aren't to get like visibly in the same spaces anymore, etc. It's as much as can be possible given the situation. It's not a magic fix of trauma, and just because it's outside the carceral system. The hope is just that it stops it from repeating, and that offers an easier pathway to healing, even though it takes quite a bit of time to get there.
And hopefully it doesn't continue causing harm in the way that the carceral system can. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, that makes me think of like the role that like I feel like capitalism overall like plays in it too. It's just like I think that the way that I answer this is just thinking about like the organization that I work for, and like really wanting us to take an approach that's more like transformative justice or something, like for instances of harm, and we just like don't do that, and we have like a very like sterilized policy that's like very quick. And I think even like a space that like could claim to be radical can like go onto those policies that are like, okay, then we'll do that and we'll move on, and there's that like pressure under capitalism to like keep going, just like get back to normal. It's always like, how can we get back to normal without addressing that like, well, was never a normal, but also like permitting something to take a long time. I just don't think that it's very difficult to like even convince an organization that is like claims to be radical, like to really engage with like what centering like a survivor means.
Yeah, we had talked a little bit about like short-term intervention versus long-term.
Yeah.
And like that there can be a greater response and like more support in like the crisis intervention moment of like, oh my gosh, something is happening.
Yeah,
We need to address it immediately. People come and then the survivor is left kind of alone for like the years that follow, which is like kind of that long-term care and really like, again, counter to that quick fix mentality of get it over with, let's go back and, you know, just continue as if everything's fine, but that's not the reality of trauma or healing from trauma. It's that long term.
I love that you brought up, I mean, capitalism, it's sort of the undertone for a lot,
Yeah.
of course, and that should be stated, but the financial and capitalist aspect of abuse is crazy, especially for like queer and trans folks, when you think about like who is in poverty and who has access to jobs as is, and especially if you're coming from like abuse and sex work capacity, you know, and a lot of times when we find out about IPV, et cetera, with like trans women, especially Black and brown trans women, is like when they get murdered or go missing, partially because they literally do not have the financial resources to leave. And so that is also like a huge thing with that. Yeah, it's like, and also goes to long-term care of like, even if we get the money for you to like meet it immediate, what do we do if you literally cannot support yourself on your own?
yeah.
Because often too, I think like if it's like two trans people in a relationship, like the abuser also might not have funding to like
Yeah.
get out, because that's what happened to me.
Yeah.
At least for like a period of time. I just like couldn't get him to leave. When like we had multiple conversations that I was gonna stay in the home, and he was going to leave, and then he kept trying to like. None of it makes sense, but like just getting me to pay for him to leave, and it's like that's it's just overly complicated. Each situation is unique, and there's so many layers of everything, even like neurodivergence and you know what people do for work, if they do work, disability, like all of it's like very complicated, and none of it is ever going to be easy or quick.
Complicated is the theme. Yeah, this doesn't know anything. So I guess just like as we kind of wrap, what are your thoughts around like, what do you wish was available? Like, what is kind of like the dream scenario of like where we want things to go for our, like from our own personal experiences, but also just like how we see our communities as a whole of what could be improved and what could be provided.
I mean, for dreaming, right? That means abolition, and that means inspiration. And so the dream model really is that you're like in independently sovereign communities that are self-sustaining, that are based on care and healing. And so when trauma has happened, it is addressed and held and worked to heal in the immediate, so it doesn't perpetuate, and where everyone is invested in that. And so the survivor gets to be held, and the abuser or harmer gets to be held in a way where no one is feeling unsafe, and we're both have access to healing and the resources to do so, including housing, including work, including you know, all food needs. Yes.
Which I think should be
Yes, you really, it's like, you know, they say it's not PTSD if you're still in trauma, it's not post. It's not, you can't heal if you're still in fight or flight. You can't heal if it's still happening. And so I think that's where a lot of us sort of mistake some of that, is that like, under the systems that we're in, and the models that we exist in, how possible is it even to like really truly heal? If the truth is we're kind of always in fight or flight, or we're always in like a place where our nervous systems aren't unsettled. Like, do you have the capacity to heal if you're trying to survive? And so obviously for dreaming, it would mean that those needs are a risk. So that healing can be like your main objective.
I also feel like so much, not that there wouldn't be any harm, but I think that if all of our needs were met in that basic way, that there would be so much less.
Oh, absolutely.
Because there's less, then there's like there's less opportunity to leverage people too. Because in so many of the situations I've been in, there's just like ways that, like you said, the financial aspect is like leverage or moved around, it's such a weight on us. That, or housing, you know, something like that. I think it would really, it would be harder for those things to happen and easier for them to feel. You know? And the other thing that I think about, like also towards like dreaming, is like I think a lot about like youth, and I really wish that there was more room for us to like talk about like what abuse cycles really look like as youth. Like I think that we gently touch on bullying, and I think just I hate the word bullying because I think it is like an incredibly dismissive way to talk about like people experiencing transphobia, fatphobia, racism, like because that's what it is. Like, it's just children enacting those systems. And I wish that we like equip children more to be like, and I think the reason why we don't is because our school systems are so messed up.
Are those things?
They are those things.
Yeah.
So you can't teach someone about it, because if you teach them, then they'll be like, this is messed up. But I want more space for youth to know that, because I think that if I were taught more of my value as a youth, I think that, because I was abused as a child, and I think that I just internalized that for a long time, that like not being worthy, and that makes you more prone to the abuse as an adult, because like it's something to continue to have to unwork, is that not feeling like you deserve to just like have an opinion, you know?
Even just like going off of that, like, normalizing, like people normalizing corporal punishment as a child. Cause that happened, we really had, like Mississippi's a whole other world. We had corporal punishment in schools, and they had like a paddle, like a wooden paddle that they would get at me with, and that's like a weird, like not common thing for most folks, but it's like if your parents are doing it to you, if your school is doing it to you. It's normal for your partner to also hurt you. Because clearly when you're bad, there's like physical pain that will occur to you. And so that just creates this cycle of violence and pain. So I think like deconstructing those things and equipping people when they're younger, with like, this is what a healthy relationship looks like, or this is an example of a healthy relationship. Hitting is not normal in any circumstance, unless someone trips on you, I guess, but like, you know, like on purpose. But I think like each organization having a dedicated response to abuse is really important. It's something that has teeth. So it's not just like words, but there's actual like results that come from it, I think is really critical, because that's in my experience, in both of my situations, the organizations that I interacted with around me really did not take anything seriously, and that just can't happen, because that's how people just fall through the cracks. That's how they stay in situations longer. That's how they die from that. And I think it's really critical that we have safety nets, people that care everywhere, because then it's a more robust response, and then we can have like community coming in and helping, because that felt in my situation, that felt much more meaningful to me when it was community response versus kind of like a colder sort of like organizational response that didn't exactly fit in my situation. Like my community knows me and loves me and cares about me as a human being, so it's like they're coming in with love and affection and robust support, and the other one is just like, here you go, here's a packet of stuff, you know. And it's not the same. Human response.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I had one friend who stayed with me through the experience and like just automatically believed me, and that one person made such a difference to me, just to know that like, okay, I'm believed, I'm trusted, and like, it's somebody who's known me for a while, who knew me through the relationship and is staying there, like, that consistency was really impactful. Yeah, I think what I would add as like the dream stuff is sort of what you were mentioning, Kara, was the models of relationships, right? Like, there were so few models of queer relationships growing up that like there wasn't anything to replicate. The hetero relationships around me like were not interesting to me or really healthy. And like, so what are we looking to, and can we have like a more diverse representation around that, and just like more openness around conversations, like just being able to like know what is it like to be in a relationship from people that are in my community but maybe don't talk about their relationship. And then in addition to like the community support, I think we had talked about it a little bit, Robin, but this like an expanded capacity to hold space for difficult feelings and emotions.
Yeah.
And like part of the challenge for me is like the response of just like kind of deer in the headlights from other people, like their eyes would just get wide and they wouldn't know what to say or do, and like then that sort of reinforced my discomfort with my own feelings and situations, and reinforced the sense that like I needed to be silent and shouldn't be sharing these things. So yeah, just having greater capacity from my community around like witnessing those moments and holding space for those moments, which doesn't necessarily mean fixing or changing. In that space, I think is really valuable and a skill set that I want more of us to develop.
I would say also holding space for the messiness that
Oh yeah,
Oh my god,
super busy.
yeah, people have such an issue with like messiness, right? Which I mean, it also goes to like, are you as projective, are you as quiet, are you as whatever, right? Which is very colonial, very capitalist. And so especially for like marginalized people, was there's also a lot of times there's like an overlap of things like addiction and things like work, et cetera, et cetera. So it's like, there is no perfect victim, and there is no perfect healing model as well. And I know like I would always say like, we're here for whatever gets you through the day, quite frankly, without judgment, as long as it's not replicating harm. But it's like, if that means that you're, engaging with substances, or you're, in coping mechanisms that are honestly helpful. There's no judgment there of like, oh, you're not doing this correctly, or in a way that warrants support, because you're too much of a mess. And also like the emotional toll, I also do want to hold that of like how long in the process that it takes so long, and because we don't have like full models where people can take turns holding people, that weight does sometimes fall on like one person, two people, and like as much as it's obviously a larger weight for the person going through it, it is still a weight for the people who are like holding it. And also probably, given again who usually shows sympathy, it's usually people who like have gone through some of the things, or also have things that they themselves are trying to hold. And that is it is a burden. It's not like too much of a burden. I don't want to like feed into that language of like you are a burden, but the emotional weight that like our models force upon these folks like is a huge weight for folks to hold, and especially for that long, because you're like, okay, I have the capacity to hold this in such an intense way for like this amount of time, but now that we're like a year in, or a couple months in, it's like, and you're just like, you're still messy, what do I do? Like, and I think a lot of people tend to just, that's when people will drop or isolate more. I like to think more so than maybe there's like a second wave when it's like farther into it, where it's like you're still not good in a way that I can't hold. And what do we do that?
That's the question.
I'm just about to wrap up and do Q&A, so almost. So I just wanted to give an opportunity for everyone to have any final thoughts to wrap up before we do Q&A. You can share about your work, whatever else relevant feels necessary.
Do a shameless plug. Well, just talking about like relationships, like I write queer books for kids, and like one of the reasons why I write that is because, and they're mostly romances, is because I didn't have those like models for relationships, and I really wanted to write messy but kind relationships, and so that's usually how I approach it. And so if you want to read romances about queer, queer young adults, and some stories about grief, for like middle school age, I would say that adults like them too, so you can check them out.
I think just the thought that I'm having is like, just because you're smart enough to understand why somebody might be doing something doesn't mean that you deserve harm because of that. And it's like if you were in another situation where you weren't identifying like, oh, this person is traumatized, therefore they're doing harm. You might just leave, you know? And so just because you can hold space for that doesn't mean you deserve it. And doesn't mean that it's okay. Especially if that person isn't trying to reform. I think a lot of queer people are very like kind, and we try to hold space for that trauma, but it doesn't mean that it's okay if you're being hurt.
I'd say for here, March and Great Culture is sort of on a hiatus, but our Instagram and Facebook are still open, and that's a pathway to get in contact with us to facilitate support mediation resources. And then Take Back the Night is still active, and happens usually the last Thursday of April every year. And that's such a powerful thing here. A lot of organizations are queer or trans sex workers, like that's sort of the way that Take Back the Night Philly is different than like Take Back the Night the like national. Like it was started by like folks in recovery and like street economies, et cetera, et cetera. And so we do have like a event where like we, bust myths and stuff like that, but there's also like a giant survivor share that lasts until people are done. And folks just sort of sit and sometimes come year after year and just sit to hold space. And then sometimes like will come up and share, and sometimes it's the first time they've ever shared in their lives. That sort of thing is really powerful to me. It is not everyone can hold it. It is we do kind of jokingly call it like trigger fest, because it's like everyone is sort of doing it, but we have support networks there, like therapists, and what have you, and also resource tabling for folks. And I think survivor events like that are super important in aftercare. And so I encourage folks to, even if that sort of thing isn't, but like engaging in survivorship in general as to healing is really important. I encourage folks to engage in it.
Awesome, thank you. All right, so we will open it up for Q&A, and I just want to again let everybody know that it is being recorded. So if you don't want your voice to be recorded, that's what the note cards are. So if you want to write a question or comment anonymously, you can, and then just pass it to the front. But yeah, open to Q&A or comments. Yeah, go ahead. You want
There are a lot of questions, so there's so much nuance in what each of you shared that is so poignantly captured the complexities of observing an apparatus, which is like all of these things, and then being able to figure out how to relate to them simultaneously in real time. And so I wanna just really thank you for the leadership and the vulnerability and just the way you captured all that nuance. I really appreciated some of the things you said specifically about transformative justice and trying to figure out what are some good, if you have any that come to the top of mind, is in terms of like resources, longer works, shorter works, that you think are helpful in developing just like a really kind of robust understanding of that framework and its applications.
Yeah, Miriam Kaba and Mia Mingus are sort of like the two biggest. Miriam Kaba and Mia Mingus are two of like the biggest folks, and they're both, one is a Black woman and one is a woman of color, I believe.
I'm sorry, how do you spell the?
Mariame Kaba is MARIAME and then KAPBA. And then Mia Mingus is MIAMINGUS.
Can I add to what you said?
Yeah.
Marianne Kala also has a workbook that she made with another organizer. I think it's not We Do This for Us. What is
Yeah, it might be it.
No, there's a newer one.
Yeah,
There's
so
a-
there's that
there's-
the big boy
There's been like,
and then the smaller boy.
I have a reading, I can share a reading list. As
As
well, like, yeah.
Yeah,
So there's also Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who writes a lot about this as well.
yeah, Marian Cohen also does like trainings, and I believe
Yeah.
Mingus also does trainings. In addition to like their readings, there's a good collective, actually I did that, was Transformer Justice like in like conflict in movement spaces, which is like obviously not our subtopic here today, but it's greatly intersecting, for sure. So I would absolutely recommend, those are my biggest go-tos, and they're also like, yeah.
This is the book, it's called Problem Towards Repair.
Yeah,
And it's
that's the one.
Yeah, there's also another workbook that an organizer made that is like, that's what I'm thinking of it, when I said big boy, it's like this thick. And it's really similar, but it's just like more.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And then I have one other question. I love the plug for your book. I would love to read it, but I would will give you a title and where I can find it.
Oh, sure. The first one is called A Million Quiet Revolutions. And if you Google it, you can find it on like Barnes Noble. I always encourage buying from your local bookstore to not support Amazon. But it is on Amazon. And Ode to My, what?
It's on Bookshelf.
Yes, definitely. And then Ode to My First Car. Those are the two young adult ones.
You should also get Dear Mothman. That's the middle grade book. It's very good.
What's it called?
Dear Mothman.
I like monsters.
What's it called? Problem
Thanks
Towards
for-
Repair.
Yes, go for it.
Well, thank you, Heather, for organizing today's panel. Thank you to all the panelists for being so open and vulnerable with your stories, and allowing us in. First part question is around terminology. Restorative justice is a term that has been used in the past, and so I'm wondering how you think about restorative justice versus transformative justice in this sense. Is there a difference? What is the difference on the screen?
Yeah, so there is a difference. Restorative justice is typically those models within systems that we already have. So like education models would really be like restorative justice. It's sort of yeah, trying to fix harm that we already have, and transformative justice is really about like a separate political model and framework. If that,
Can I add to that?
yeah.
Okay. My understanding was also that a lot of models started as restorative justice, and that it was also kind of co-opted by institutions. And kind of sort of zap some of the radicalness out of it. And so that it did become more of this like institutional system of, and also sort of a perspective of like trying to go back to a state pre-harm. Whereas transformative justice acknowledges that there is no pre-harm state, like we are just trying to move forward and heal and like move outside of those systems that exist already. And at least so far, I don't think transformative justice models have been as co-opted by institutions and changed and morphed in that way, but you know, I would tell.
No, I mean, by definition of some of the ways transformative justice works, that they can't be, which is
Yeah,
sort of why
right.
there is that differentiation. Yeah.
And then another question is, so you kind of talked about the gap between LGBTQ organizations and I guess more traditional IPV organizations. You mentioned Women Against Abuse and Women in Transition. And I'm curious about LGBTQ sort of organizations and I guess where, if you're aware of any effort to collaborate, merge, and be able to fill in the gaps and provide that overlap and continuum of care that sounds like it might be helpful.
Yeah, so to my knowledge, I did also mention, because I believe Mazzoni and William Way also do have DV resources within there. So can correct me if I'm wrong, and I believe even like the youth queer things of like at youth center and LA have pathways there. I know Project Safe, which is an expressly queer, and more has to do with street economy sectors and this, and there's like obviously a huge overlap there. Because like therapy research and those are, and a lot of like folks who work there are like queer and trans and et cetera, et cetera. And so those have been overlap there, but yeah, it sort of goes both ways, where there are queer and trans orgs that don't have the IPV, DV, et cetera, and the opposite of like DV, IPV, SA orgs that don't have a queer and trans lens. And so I think that is sort of like I mentioned earlier, that's sort of the activism work is to push to make sure that there are both. I mean, ideally, if enough IPV spaces have them, it wouldn't necessarily need to fall on the queer trans orgs that serve other needs. But as it stands now, the push should be to make sure that both of those have that equilibrium. Yeah.
Because I think it definitely depends on where you are in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, I'm speaking for
Yeah.
just for viewers. Yeah.
It's. So we've had conversations with. IPV orgs and LGBT centers together, and it's like.
And where are you guys?
We're in Lehigh Valley, and they're not even like, they're at like the 101 level. So they're not even, like, their idea of providing services is to have a specific separate track for LGBT people most of the time. And in any like human services organizations that we have like worked with, that's typically their like solution. And it really narrows what is available to people.
And I would say some of them don't even know that they could be that,
Yeah.
like, I think the thing that I tend to advocate for IPV like organizations is like, I feel like people need a dedicated person who is like the LGBTQ plus like victim advocate, because in my work, like, I would like advocate for that, and I advocated for like multiple identities, not just for queer folks, but like we should have had some, we should have had someone on staff who's bilingual in mobile language. We should have someone who might focus on disability. Different folks to represent like different racial groups that like might not feel comfortable like working with our staff was primarily white, so like I can imagine that's a barrier. So I think like having dedicated advocates, because my organization's response was like, well, we serve everyone, but like everyone never means everyone, you know, unless you're naming that category. And I think on the side of like the LGBTQ orgs, I think that so much is cast on this org to like, it's like you have to do all social services for LGBTQ people, because LGBTQ people can't go anywhere. So it's like shoving all these things in a building and like
with no money.
But I think on that end, I think that deepening the education on like the LGBT orgs need to be educated and like actually think about what those things mean, because I really struggled within the organization that I work for to like get people to understand like how important it is to have complex policies. Because we run like, I think 15 community groups, and I was like, abuse will happen in these community groups. How will we respond to make sure that like people don't lose their community? And also like this person doesn't just go to another community group and do the same, you know, like I think that again, that pressure of capitalism to keep going, I think has kind of made us not grapple with that. That was a long answer, but I hope that was helpful. Right?
Anything else?
I don't know, this might be too personal. I'm like struggling how to phrase it in my head for everybody, but I'm in a situation where I would want somebody to leave a situation I think is harmful, and they've refused to leave for many years. Was there something that kind of, is there anything I can do to help? Because obviously I've made my opinion known, there's nothing I can do. So was there like an aha moment for you with somebody else saying like, oh, I think you should leave, and something connected and like it actually spurred you to do it?
And from my personal experience, I was already in the midst of separating, but did not have the language of abuse. And in that moment, I had a friend from the outside say, this is abuse, right? And that was one of my big aha moments, because I was so in that sphere of like justifying everything that was happening and normalizing it. But I do not think I would have been receptive to that prior to me already being in process of separating from this person. Because I was just too infatuated with everything and too stuck in it. And I think having people that show up and express love and commitment to you, regardless of what relationship you're in, and knowing that they will be there throughout the whole process is deeply impactful. Because like you can't force them to leave a relationship, but to be a stable, loving force in someone's life is immensely powerful.
I also think like for me, like reminding someone over and over that like they deserve better, or like that they deserve this, like what you deserve in a relationship, at least for me, like the one experience I had with someone being supportive in my abuse relationship situation is someone being like, you don't deserve to feel like that. And I remember that feeling empowering because it wasn't focused on that other person. It was like really focused on like their relationship with me. And I think that has always been like how I leaned on, like even when I was like doing domestic violence work, like that is what I leaned on, is like because you can't know all the dynamics with that person, like really focusing on like that person's needs that are being harmed or not met, and like helping them find that in themselves, because abusers like wear down your like ability to believe that you deserve those things. Yeah.
Or even just believe your own experience.
Yeah.
And so like validating people I think is really important. So if they're telling you like this happened to me, just being like, wow, that's really terrible.
Yeah.
You don't deserve that. Like things like that. Cause I agree, like I know I wouldn't have left if someone was just like, you should really leave. Cause it's just more complicated than that. But I think being that like solid support, being there like consistently, expressing love, like you said, I think you did that for me too, like when I was going through this last one, like you just like saying you don't deserve this, this is bad, like I'm worried for you. That might be like too direct, but like
I think sometimes it can be a wake up call though, to say like, I feel concerned for your safety, because like that's a way that like you can honestly engage with a situation without like telling someone exactly what to do. But like people also should know that like if your family cares about you, or like if your family cares about you, like that's something to sometimes, for me, it helped me wake up more, because I was like, oh, like this person is worried for me. That's interesting. Like it validates my worries for myself and all that kind of stuff. So I don't know. I thought it was.
yeah, because most people know that something is wrong at the very least. Like, even if we're still like lost in the sauce of the relationship, like we're like, that didn't feel good. I feel bad all the time. So like they'll have that awareness. It's just like at some point they'll be ready to like grapple with it more meaningfully perhaps, and like start that process of getting out, because it really is like kind of like a process of grief, I think.
Yeah.
Like you like go through those phases in grief, so you have to be like at the right stage to get out. And then you might try to leave multiple times and it doesn't necessarily work. I felt myself like I could, it's very disturbing, but it's like you see yourself doing something and you know what's happening, like you're going back and you're like, I want this to stop, but you can't make yourself stop. And I don't know what the like biological mechanism of that is, but it's like terribly disturbing, and it's going to happen, like that most people do not get out the first time.
Yes, I sort of also bring awareness of like the cycle of it. I think anytime I've supported folks who I was close to, I really feel like they should, at a minimum, break up if it was just like toxic, but really seek a safety plan, or recognition of that it is abuse. It's also being like, and you tell yourself this all the time, right? It's like, oh, but like there's the low, but then there's the high, then there's the high, and the trauma bond abuse cycle. Especially if there isn't physical violence, and it's emotional, right? It's like it wears you down to where you think you believe it, but then there's also the high again, and your body literally becomes addicted to it. I think that's been a wake up call for some folks that I've spoken to, is that like if I show them something, they're like, oh, I didn't realize it was like literally like a serotonin or something in my literal body that is making me like miss, like now that I'm in this low and I can't get that, I like am literally physically creating that high again of the like that's why sometimes even when you're in healthy relationships afterwards, you still sort of crave that like high low dynamic, and then from everyone else that just like for me it's the consistency of like I don't judge you for staying. I like am concerned in this way and I want to bring it to your attention that I feel so here's why it would be healthiest for you to maybe be in a different position, and but I'm here for you no matter what. Even if you stay in this relationship, I am still your friend, I am still around, I am not isolating you and I am not leaving. And also this is not a timed out, like a timed out thing. If years from now you feel like you want to leave, I'm here and you can go to that. And I'd also say more broadly, I know like your politics, but I also say for like folks that like your outward politics on like believing survivors and domestic violence also have such an impact about whether or not people feel safe to like go to you. So even if you're saying to someone like, oh, I feel concerned you blah blah, but it's like I've also seen the things that you've said and done regarding other people's things. So like your word to me isn't necessarily doesn't really mean much. I just don't believe you. And so I think that sort of like consistency and safety of like you as a person and like you are not going anywhere, you self-worth, you like these things are lies, like really combating the ways that they're bringing you down, especially again in emotional abuse situations where it's very easy to tell yourself that it's not abuse or it's not bad because you're physically fine. Because honestly, emotional abuse has wears down your physical symptoms. But
Yeah. I appreciate you mentioning the cycles of abuse too, and like that kind of getting caught in that. I mean, I will say that when I started separating, I literally went through a detox. Like I could not move for days. Like it was a deep physical crisis. So like when you're asking somebody to leave is also asking them to engage in a detox. And like if you think about somebody who's addicted to drugs, like that is a really intense emotional and physical experience. And at least from my own experience, it was similar in leaving a relationship. So which I don't think a lot of people really understand, like how intense that physical experience is.
Your nervous system literally has to like
Totally shuts down.
And so it's like
I'm not getting this drug, I'm not.
it like it everything's your body. It's like
I was kind of second what they all said as like, I think for me, in my experiences, having friends that didn't judge me, that were concerned for me, but also didn't give me ultimatums. Was really important, because there's an after, like you were thinking, after you get out, it's like, what is my world gonna look like now? Where am I going to stay? Where, how if it's affected my ability to go to work, like there's like there's so many different things to think about. And sometimes in the moment when you're in an abusive relationship, it's just like, this is the easier thing to do, or it's more comfortable just to stay. And also I think, so I guess supporting, your friend in that way, like just being there for them, but also protect your own self as well. I want to say that, hold space for yourself, and like, because it takes a lot to witness. And so I do want to say that. And another thing for me was understanding that there's various types of abuses. It's like financial abuse, there's emotional abuse, that was mentioned. And sometimes when you put it in those terms, people are like, oh, I didn't realize there was this pattern. I didn't realize, so yeah. But thank you for asking that question and being there.
Yeah, thanks for your vulnerability.
Sometimes also, folks don't care as much about themselves as they care about others. So I know for me, one time I was like recognizing that this is what it is, and I should speak out or leave her answer. It's because I realized that there was a pattern outside of me. And there always is. Right, and so sometimes I think if you're able to point out the way that this person is like harmful to others as well, it or has been in the past, or the way that this relates to us and things, is awesome.
Yeah, that was an important contextualization for me as well, is seeing the harm that they were doing to others. Right.
Yeah.
Feels different.
Yeah.
When you're talking to somebody else versus yourself.
Yeah. Which is why coming forward can be so powerful, in itself, even about one person, because it's like, I came forward about someone once, and it's like, I have folks in my DMs are like, whatever, being like, this happened to my friend, or like, whatever, and the only reason I did it is because I realized that they had like just done it to like another person, in a sort of like worse way, or in a way that I was like, oh, this is, yeah, and you can be like, oh, this be like, oh, that's the thing happened to me, and very complicated. So, yeah.
Well, thank you, everyone. I think we're closed, unless there's any other burning desires. No. Thank you. Thank you. And we'll be around if